Okay. This is David. This is not the note-taker version of David. This is the real life version of David. For better, for worse, maybe you like the note-taker version more. That's okay. I'm not offended. But we've got Mika with us here who wants to talk to us about doing less and achieving more. I can imagine that this group might be interested in that. I hope you are. And Mika's got some really cool stuff that she wants to help us with that catchy headline there. I will turn it over to Mika. But Mika, thank you so much for doing this.
Amazing. Thank you, David.
Melissa, who is your furry friend? We got to meet your furry friend real quick.
Oh, sure. This is Puma.
Oh, wow.
Hi. If it's not one, it's the
Excellent.
other. Lynx is gray and white, and he's sleeping in the corner where he belongs.
So he
Cool.
may be a note taker today, maybe.
All right,
Amazing.
now officially over to you, Mika.
Amazing. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to the Chief of Staff Network. Welcome, everybody. Super excited to see your faces and to meet you. I know I'm going to be talking about time management today, as you may have seen. So how to use your calendars, how to effectively plan and how to use your time. And yeah, I changed it to do less, achieve more, because essentially this is what it is about. And yeah, so my name is Mika. I'm the co-founder of a company called Tackle. And this presentation is based on years of collaboration and work with executives and chief of staff at different organizations. And so this is actually the first of its kind where I'm putting all this information together, and I'm super excited to present it to you. And yeah, so let's move over. So what did we learn in working with executives? So we've learned that top executives actually have a few habits, and we've seen some patterns. And so, by the way, you can actually see my screen, but you don't see, that's fine, right? You see the entire screen.
Yeah, it's good. It's good on my side.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, so in working with top executives, we've realized that most of them and their chiefs of staff or their closest allies actually do something called the calendar audit. How many of you have heard of a calendar audit? Could you just maybe react with an emoji or raise your hand? Okay, there's some people here. Awesome. Okay, so we've noticed that top executives, either they themselves or their chief of staff or their executive assistant, somebody who is close to them, who understands their line of work, actually does something like calendar audit. And there's been a few studies that show that it actually leads to a significant productivity increase. It saves people time, and it actually, a lot of tasks that we invest our time into, we underrate them in terms of how much effort they're going to cost us. And so top executives that we've worked with actually take 15 minutes of their time every week to run a calendar audit, maybe every month, and then actually make sure that their time and energy goes in the right places. And so if it's something that you're maybe looking to do, it's something that you want to wow your executive with, or maybe just have a little bit more impact on their work, or maybe scale their impact better, try to do a calendar audit. It may be a very effective tool to achieve just that. And so with the executives that we work with, I actually have noticed two different things that they do continuously. One is that they are incredibly protective of their time. So they don't say yes easily to different things. I'm sure that's something you've probably seen in working with your executive, their principal. They're incredibly protective of their time. They want to make sure it goes in all the right places. And then another thing that I've noticed is instead of talking about work-life balance, a lot of them talk about the energy balance. So because basically the traditional work-life balance is a notion that's a little bit broken. It's like life gives us energy and work takes energy. And so that's why we have to have some sort of work-life balance. For them, it's more about energy balance. So what are the energy generating activities or activities that give us energy versus activities that take energy in their day-to-day. And so with these two things combined, they're actually able to understand how they're spending their time, how they're spending their energy, and make sure that it's directed at all the right places. And this is actually, as I noticed this with the executives that we worked with, tried to connect with a few more people who actually are big fans of calendar audit, of time audit. And I found super interesting insights and super interesting conversations took place as a result of that. For example, Matt Moshari, who is the executive coach of people like Sam Altman and Brian Armstrong of Coinbase. He is a big advocate of the calendar audit, the energy audit. Matilda Collin, who wrote that she is the co-founder of Front. She wrote that discipline is something that actually enabled her company's growth. And if you're not disciplined with managing your time, it's going to be very tough to succeed. And so there are a lot of resources that navigate towards how to do the calendar audit in a better, more effective way. And I hope that if you take anything from this webinar today, it's just to how to use it properly and how to use it effectively so that it actually adds value to you and not something that you spend time on that will not actually impact a lot in the long run. And so having had conversations with the students of Matt Moshari and with Matt Moshari, we've gathered some best practices. Before we jump into that, why it actually matters. 14 hours on average is how much an executive works. And there's also studies that show that 70% of their time is not actually in line with their long-term objectives. And 96% of leaders are burned out at least once in their careers. And so that leads to a lot of missed opportunities, misalignment between vision and actions, and in general, slower company growth. And you probably know by now that, yeah, executive time is just one of the most valuable assets that a company has. And so optimizing that can have a much better effect. Is this something that you also see? Is this a topic that seems to be something that you can resonate with, that people work a lot, that maybe the time investment is not as where it should be? If so, you can just raise your hand or maybe react with an emoji or anything like that. Yeah. Okay. I see some people nodding. Yeah. Amazing. If at any point in time you have any questions, feel free to interrupt and we'll make sure we'll have a discussion on this. Okay, so now to the actual point, the calendar audit or the time audit. So how do we actually do it? Basically, there are two techniques that will help you understand how time and energy are already being spent. So one of them, the first one, is the calendar audit. So we'll talk a little bit about how to run a calendar audit. Then the second one is about energy audit, so understanding which activities take or drain energy. And then hopefully trying to find the new approach of like how to do it better. And yeah, so the calendar audit, basically it's very simple. You have your executive's calendar, maybe even your own calendar, and maybe you're using some techniques already to understand how you're spending your time. But basically the key questions that are important in order to run a calendar audit are as follows. So the first one is, how does my principal spend their time and their energy? So where does their time go? Where does their energy go? Just having a very clear understanding of what are the main chunks of, or like what are the main activities that take their time? Is it some strategic bets? Is it some operational things? Is it time with their team leads? Is there something specific that you can think of? Like these are maybe the top 5 activities that they're spending their time on, and you just want to have some clarity on what that distribution looks like. So that's the question number 1. Question number 2 is, how well does their week reflect your company's priorities at the moment? So the idea of this exercise is just understand whether or not how they're spending their time is actually what you discuss in your latest strategic meeting or in your latest strategy meeting, in your QBRs or anything that has more of this long-term planning. So how well does their week actually reflect their priorities, as question number 2. And it's not, I guess like we all have like very, very busy lives, and we have fires to fight, we have things to accomplish. And this question is something to take us back a little bit and just to take a pause and to think whether or not what we're doing this week will actually matter in 1 year from now, not just in the next month. Yeah, so this is the question number 2. Question number 3, and this is something that I've learned it from one CEO that we were actually supporting during the calendar audit. And his main question for the calendar audit is basically just, how much time am I spending on running versus growing my business? And he was explaining it to me. He said, it's very simple. If I just keep running my business as is today, I cannot expect a much greater outcome in the future. So if I'm not investing into any big bets, into any strategic directions, into entering new markets, or I don't know, just betting on something, I cannot expect a much greater outcome. My business will just stay as is, and I can expect this type of growth rate, for example. And so he makes sure that he sets time aside for growing the business, basically. He has this perfect formula that he has, just how much time for growing the business, how much time for running the business, and how much time for any personal matters. So this is the question number 3. Question number 4 is a super, super interesting exercise, just to think of the value that you're creating for your company or for your customers in every meeting. So is the value that you're creating, or is the value that your principal is creating in every activity, is it around $10, $100, $1,000? Like how much, like what kind of impact can you expect from this type of meeting? It's very interesting because it's not supposed to be this exercise where you actually put a very accurate number. It's not about that. And it's also not about going through every activity and understanding the value. It's just to have a basic idea of how much value you're generating for your business, and just having a rough understanding that you can actually go ahead and eliminate any $10 meetings, for example, from your principal schedule, or something that you don't see will be actually valuable enough for them to spend their time on. And yeah, hopefully after having reviewed these questions, you will have a very good idea of what activities are actually the highest leverage, which ones are the lowest leverage, and then make certain decisions that will help you rearrange the resources, rearrange the time investment, and increase their impact in the organization. So this is the calendar audit. These are the main questions. I would say I would probably just encourage everyone to review the calendar, maybe in the past month, maybe in the past week. Have some rough answers to these questions. What are the main chunks, or what are the main activities that take my principal's time? How well does it reflect priorities? How much time are we spending on growing versus running the business? What's the value that we're creating? And what's the highest versus lowest leverage? You can visualize it in a dashboard. You can just do some color coding, and that will already give you some idea. There are very different ways to do it. There's also like the lowest effort and maybe the highest effort. You can just start very, very low and then see where that takes you, and that if that impacts any of your decision making. But just having some visualization and showing it to your principal, to your executive, can lead to a very interesting conversation. Even if that conversation takes 20 minutes of your time, it can eliminate a lot of effort in the future. So this much about calendar audit. Anybody has any questions before I move over to the energy audit? Okay, I see some people saying that there's no questions, so I guess we can move. Let's go to the next section. Oh, actually, about the calendar audit, the ratio that I was saying about the CEO who makes sure that they have enough time running the business versus growing the business. This is actually their ideal ratio. So they say they want to spend 50% of their time on growing the business versus 40% of the time on running it, and then 10% on personal things. I really like that ratio. And like I said it to a few more executives after that, and they kind of all agreed like, oh yeah, that seems to be the right ratio. It's interesting because it sets a very clear priority on growing the business versus running it. So I want to spend more time on growth initiatives. It can be big bets. It can be meeting some customers where we see a lot of upsell potential, or that seems to be the ICP for our new initiative, or something else. And then he also makes sure to include the personal stuff, because obviously we cannot really not include it in our lives. So he makes sure that he has a certain ratio, and then he keeps this pie chart kind of like there to see how he spends his time. And yeah, obviously you can also see within running the business, what are the actual things that take up my time? Is it some urgent matters? Is it leadership meetings, something like that? So you can actually make decisions on how to reduce that, for example. Okay, energy audit. It's actually something that is that I learned based on my work of working with executives and understanding where their time goes. They, as I said, don't only talk about where their time goes, but also what their energy balance looks like. that was super interesting. And working with some executive coaches, so these executives actually connected me with executive coaches. I realized that they actually recommend something like the 75-80% rule. So essentially the idea is every person is not just principals, anybody, any human should be spending at least 75 to 80% of the activities that they do during the day-to-day should actually give us energy versus take energy from us. And that was such a, I don't know how you feel about this. For me, it was a little bit almost like revolutionary to hear about it, because it feels like you have so much to do. And of course, everything's going to take energy, right? Like you have all these ambitious goals and you have all of this. But the idea is actually, no, focus on something where your energy is the highest. That's how you can create the highest impact. And that's how you can be most effective. Yeah. So, that was super interesting. So 75 to 80% should be giving us energy. And where that comes from, I'm not sure if you've seen this before, but basically there's 4 zones of where we can operate: zone of excellence, zone of incompetence, zone of competence, and then there's zone of genius. So the idea is there are some things that we're good at, and there are some things that we're not so good at. And so the things that we are, for example, not good at, zone of incompetence, we know that others can do better than us. And we know that we're also not big fans of doing it. This is something that we should immediately delegate to somebody else. Zone of competence is something that we can do, but also some other people can do it. And so it doesn't have to be us who does this task. Then there's things like zone of excellence. We actually know we're really, really good at it, but maybe it's not giving us a lot of energy anymore. Maybe it used to give us energy, not now. And so zone of excellence it can be very, very tricky to get rid of it, because we're usually better at it than anybody else. And then there's zone of genius. And the idea of the energy audit is to try to maintain a schedule where we're spending 80%, 75% of our time in the zone of genius. So we're really, really good at this task. So we're uniquely positioned to do them, but also they give us a lot of energy. And yeah, so how to run an energy audit. I realize this will be a little bit trickier. If the calendar audit is something that you can do on behalf of your principal without involving them first, this is something that either you could encourage them to do, or you can actually do it together with them. It's going to be very hard to answer these questions without them, because obviously you don't know what gives them energy. But basically, the best practices here are you could review the principal's activities. Highly recommended just the last 2 weeks, because that's usually a very good representation of how they spend their time and energy. So their activities, ask if it's just like green and red, basically. Did it give you energy or did it add energy? And then based on that, you'll already hopefully see a visualization of the past 2 weeks, and you'll see if what's the percentage there. Is it 30%? Is it 80%? And that's probably how the executive is going to feel. So everybody that I've worked with that has done the energy audit, they're like, this is exactly how I felt it was going, but we just never had this conversation. The energy audit was something that encouraged this conversation. And we could actually, instead of thinking about it something like, oh, is it almost like a selfish thing to do, to think of my own needs, they started to think about it strategically as a very big asset that a company can leverage. And so, yeah, after the energy audit and the calendar audit alike, actually, you have 3 options on how to change your schedule. You can either outsource some activities. So some people are just better at it, zone of incompetence, maybe it's zone of excellence. You can either eliminate them entirely. Maybe it doesn't need to be done at all. Maybe you can automate it. Maybe there's some other ways to finish the task. And then the third one is make it exquisite. So let's say it's zone of excellence. Maybe the CEO really, really doesn't like doing all hands, for example, but they absolutely have to, because nobody else can do it for them. And they just have to do it. So then we can think about how to make it exquisite for them. Maybe we can prepare some data that they will actually have, maybe instead of like 1 hour before the meeting or 3 days before the meeting, maybe it will make them feel better if it's like 1 week before the meeting or something like that. So how to make it exquisite, or how to maybe connect it with a certain task, or on that day that we'll only have activities that give us energy, is how you can make it exquisite. So you can brainstorm with your principal on how to make it a little bit better for them. And hopefully after that conversation has taken place, you can turn these insights into action, eliminate tasks, outsource tasks, make them exquisite, see what adds, what is the highest leverage, what's the lowest leverage in their calendar, and then turn it into an ongoing practice. It can be a monthly audit, for example. It can be quarterly. Some people like to do it weekly, just for 10 minutes. But yeah. And yeah, hopefully by doing that, you can enable the zone of genius, maybe for yourself, maybe for your principal, maybe somebody else in your life. And yeah, this is basically it. I would love for us to take some time to do an exercise. So David and I actually planned a little something. We will navigate you towards breakout rooms. And the idea here is to encourage you to run a very, very small calendar audit just now. So if you could open your calendars, maybe review the last 2 weeks with one another and decide on the categories that you will actually like to use. So for example, how much is like growing the business versus running the business or something else? Maybe you have some other initiatives going on in your life. You can maybe use colors, for example, if you're not doing that already. Just use certain colors that represent the categories of how you spend your time. And then just ask 2 questions. So what was this activity about? So which category can I assign to? And did it take or did it add energy? And then if you're using Google Calendar, you'll see time insights. You'll already see a little bit of a pop-up that will show you some visualization. And yeah, do you
Cool.
guys have any questions about this?
So yeah, we're gonna review the last 2 weeks. Lisa, go for it.
Just if you have like certain things that you can't be shown on your calendar due to sensitivity on things, like does that make a difference?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to participate, obviously. But yeah, it's just between 2 people. You'll not be showing it to everybody.
Got
And
it.
we'll not record that part.
Got it.
Yeah.
Good question. Cool. Any other questions before we go into breakouts? Mika, do you see Jen's question? Or Jen, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jen. I'm just curious if you have any tips on persuading your principal to make changes to where they're spending their time based on the outcomes of the audit.
Yeah, that's a great question. It kind of obviously depends a little bit on the type of company with the principal. I know that staff role, it's definitely all about the trust. I would encourage it from a perspective of understanding what their key initiatives are. So if they propose certain initiatives and they propose something that needs to be done, that is something you can use as a data point to say, if maybe you can share your concerns. Are we not spending enough time on this? Or I'm feeling like this is not going in the right direction as it should. It can come from a place of that, but it can also come from your own motivation to make sure that you all go in the same direction or all walking in the right direction. That's a tricky one. It really depends on your relationship with them. What are your thoughts? Is it something that you think you will have hard times having conversation about it?
Yeah, thanks for the follow-up. No, I actually have a pretty close relationship with my principal, but I'm just curious, like I've actually done this audit before and he was sort of like sort of dismissive of the process, I guess, a little bit. I think he kind of like feels like he flies a little bit more intuitively. So I was curious if you had any just insight on that. I mean, it's nothing that's like, an incredible boulder for me. I was just curious to hear another's perspective. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I think one thing is for sure that we've seen in our work, we've seen that a lot of people actually underestimate the effort that goes in certain initiatives. So even if you have a gut feeling about how they usually spend their time, there's still very surprising data points. And if there's no surprising data points, maybe that's great news. Maybe they're so well reflected that they really don't need to do it. So it kind of depends on how their gut feeling is already. Most people are quite surprised, but they don't have to be.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cool. Karina's got a question. Mika, should we take Karina's question or should we go to breakouts?
Oh, we can take another question. Sure.
Okay. Karina, do you want to come off me and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that there's always like inevitable emergencies or things that you can't foresee that crop up. And I'm often thinking about how to leave room for that in my principal schedule. So I was curious if you saw that sort of thing falling anywhere within the 50, 40, 10% ratio, yeah, just like leaving space for emergencies or things that have to shift last minute. Does that fall into running the business, or is it kind of its own category of like, I should leave a certain amount of space for that? Curious if you
That's
have
a
any thoughts.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is a really good question. So the growing versus running the business, it's an idea. That's how some people categorize how they spend their time. It's by no means the rule. So you can come up with your own, obviously. But from the executives that I work with, usually they would put it under running the business because it's definitely not a growth initiative. It's considered something that is operational, and they would usually leave, let's say, 30% of that time of running the business to urgent matters, but make sure to plan that plan the room. It's going to happen anyway, and let's leave some room in our principal schedule for this because it's inevitable. But yeah, maybe to answer the question directly, that would be part of running the business.
Super helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
I had a quick question, and maybe you already addressed this, and sorry because I was driving when I came in. But does this audit also cover, say, for example, meeting overlap, meeting repeat, content repeat, things of that nature? Did you go over that as well, or does that go into a category? Because I mean, we had a situation in our corporation where the CEO was literally having one-on-one meetings, but inviting the entire executive leadership team, then having executive leadership team meetings, and then having report meetings. So I'm just wondering, does it go over this kind of thing as well? And then we had to change it, right? Brought to his attention and changed it.
So I'm not sure I got the question correctly. So the question is
Meeting overlap, content overlap, and it clogging up the schedule. So being too meeting heavy, I suppose, and repeating topics.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's another aspect of the calendar audit. It's not necessarily of how we're spending our time versus it's more about is my schedule too packed with things? Do I have too many meetings, for example? Sometimes people like to answer the question of how
And
many meetings am I
repeat content, I think, is really my primary point.
Yeah, or repeat content. So like how many when you say repeat content, is it something about the recurring meetings, I'm assuming?
Too many recurring meetings that cover similar things.
Yeah. So I guess when you say repeat content, that could be that thing that is categories of how we spend our time. So if it's all about this project X and 80% of your time went on project X, that would be repeat content, I assume. So that would be kind of, if you answered that question, I would say that you will inevitably get some answers on that. So that's to that point. And then another point of a calendar audit, some people actually like to analyze how much of their time is recurring meetings and how much of their time is in meetings in total versus focus time, for example. So these are also some interesting questions that you could analyze. Hope this answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah, we can also
Cool.
take it offline. And yeah.
Cool. Okay, we'll go into breakouts for 8 minutes, Mika,
Yes, let's do it.
and then we'll come back and answer or ask any other questions you all have. And the chat has the instructions, and then we'll send another like kind of broadcast about it. We'll see you back in 8 minutes.